President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa is ready to help mediate in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, drawing on its experience at conflict resolution. For more on this, let's now speak to Roshan, Dadoo, activist and national coordinator for the South African BDS Coalition. I appreciate your time this evening. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Roshan. Now, let's talk a little bit about the BDS Coalition as a start. Can you provide an introduction to the South African BDS Coalition, including its mission and objectives?
Thank you for inviting us. The South African BDS Coalition brings together a range of different solidarity organizations in South Africa, including the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Gauteng and Cape Town, Palestine Solidarity Alliance, the South African Jews for a Free Palestine, and a number of campus groups, and then also groups in Eastern Cape, in Potchefstroom, and around the country. And we come together to demand that our government implement boycotts, divestments and sanctions. This was the call that we made during our struggle against apartheid on the international community. And as we know, the pressure that was put on the apartheid regime here internationally in support of our armed struggle, our community uprisings, our workers' struggles and strikes, all collectively together eventually pushed the world to stop having impunity for apartheid South Africa, to isolate it with sanctions, an arms embargo and an oil embargo. And we think this strategy is responding to the call of Palestinian civil society, who a broad front of all different grassroots, trade unions, civil society, NGOs, human rights organizations in Palestine issued this call to the international community. So it's part of a global campaign called by Palestinians, and we think opposed to apartheid South Africa, we have a moral and political responsibility to heed this call.
So let's talk about some of your key achievements. Would you care to describe some of these for the BDS Coalition in the period covered by the 2020 to 22 activity report?
Well, one of this year, in fact, earlier this year, you'll recall, I'm sure, that the South African Rugby Union issued an invitation to an Israeli rugby team to come to play in South Africa. And we launched immediately a campaign against that. I put a lot of pressure on the Rugby Union, on our Department of Sport, and they did cancel the invitation. So I think that was really successful, and it shows that it can be done. Then later in the year, you'll remember the Orlando Pirates were playing a team, not just an apartheid Israeli team, but Maccabi Tel Aviv, which is particularly known for its racist support. And it was a friendly match, so there was no need for them to play against this team. The match was to be played in Spain, and we caused such a fracas in South Africa. I'm sure it was on every media and conversations happening everywhere. And although the match went ahead, it went ahead really low-key. I don't think there were spectators in the stadium, and even Pirates didn't boast about winning. It just wanted it to go away and be quiet. But we're continuing to put pressure. Really, we shouldn't be playing sports with an apartheid country. We called for a sports boycott. We saw people, when the Springboks under apartheid went to play in the UK and New Zealand, people ran on the pitch. They disrupted the matches. People said, we don't want apartheid sport in our country because it's sports washing. It's pretending that you're a normal state, that you can play friendly soccer matches with. Meanwhile, we see the scenes of what's going on. This is the 7th day that missiles have been raining down on Gaza, an open-air prison where people are trapped inside. There's no electricity getting in. The apartheid state stopped the electricity, food, water, medicines, anything going in. The people are trapped there. They won't open the fence at the crossings to let people out. They're literally trapped in there with bombs raining down on their heads. Even worse, just today or late yesterday, the apartheid regime has demanded that all the people in the north of Gaza must go to the south. Well, it's a tiny place with 2.4 million people. It's the most densely populated place in the world. If those people all move to the south and there's no water, no electricity, no food, nothing coming in and out, the only reason can be is so that the forces of occupation are going to bomb the whole of the north of Gaza and squeeze people who are corridor. This can't go on. I mean, it's just contravenes every single humanitarian law, international law. It's genocide, and we can see it on our news screens every day. They must open a humanitarian corridor. They must allow the people in Gaza, their civilian people, their families, their women and children, they must allow them to have a way to leave. You can't just keep people trapped while you rain bombs on them.
Roshan, I must ask, in your view, what are some key parallels or differences between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and South Africa's experience with apartheid? You know, apartheid has sort of been used within the same phrase as a descriptor of what is going on in Gaza in many instances.
Well, I think there is now an international consensus that Israel practices the crime against humanity of apartheid as defined in the UN Apartheid Convention. This has been said, of course, for many years by Palestinians and then more recently by Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, by numerous UN bodies, the Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. There really is no doubt that anymore that Israel practices the system of oppression of apartheid. And I think that the links go back a long way, because maybe you don't know who the very first person was to call Israel an apartheid state. Well, it was Hendrik Verwoerd in 1961 who said Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. So if you don't want to believe all the human rights organizations, the Palestinian people themselves, the South African people who know what apartheid was, like Archbishop Tutu, the late Archbishop Tutu, Reverend Frank Chikane, who have both said, and Frank Chikane was just there last year, that what is happening to the Palestinian people is worse than apartheid. Even if you don't believe any of them, shouldn't the architect of apartheid himself know what apartheid is when he sees it?
Yeah. Now, finally, before we let you go, President Cyril Ramaphosa has recently said that South Africa is offering to help mediate in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, how can South Africa's own history of conflict resolution be beneficial, do you think, in this context?
I think what can be beneficial, as I was saying, is that the call on the international community that we made in support of our struggle, in support of our armed struggle, our liberation movement, in support of the communities, the school children who were uprising in 76, in support of the trade unions here, the workers' strikes that were happening in the 80s. We called on the international community to isolate apartheid South Africa. And that is exactly what we should be doing. And we think it's a shame for a post-apartheid South Africa to have an apartheid Israeli embassy here. So we think that our response should be to declare the ambassador of that apartheid embassy persona non grata, to close down the embassy, to implement a policy on sports and cultural boycott, to stand in the UN strongly and say, we know what apartheid is. Israel is practicing the crime against humanity of apartheid. And therefore, we want to see the same mechanisms in the UN that were implemented that enabled sanctions and the oil embargo, the arms embargo against apartheid here, to be put in place against Israeli apartheid.
Roshan, Dadoo, appreciate your time. Activist and national coordinator of the South African BDS Coalition.